make better placemaking and happier people. So if you want, I can start my screen and then we can just move right along. We each will have, I don't know, 5-7 minutes each person. And then we can have like an open up for conversation. Questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, Ann Sussman and her neuro team.
Okay. So thank you so much. I've started sharing my screen. Can you guys see this?
That's full screen now.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Is it Anna or Anne? How do you pronounce your name?
And most English speakers say, but Anne for the German speakers around.
Oh, okay. What do you want me to do?
I literally don't care. Almost everybody gets around.
Okay, Anne. Okay. Well, so this is going to be very quick, guys. Thank you, Anne, and thank you, Nir, for putting this together. We're going to change the world because my talk's going to be really quick about how biometrics revolutionizes architecture. I started getting into this 7 years ago. I'm based in Greater Boston, and Boston's a biotech hub, so I was able to get access to some of the most sophisticated labs in the country. It's absolutely mind-boggling. So what you can do now today is you can actually see why traditional architecture works. This was a grant we did with Tufts with the city of New York. We're using iMotion's eye tracking that shows how someone takes in a renovated New York City library. The circles are called fixation points. That's when your brain actually gets in the visual stimuli. The lines are the saccades. And this is what she did in 15 seconds. She has no idea that her brain made her eyes move 45 times in 15 seconds, but I know because I tracked her. And then what we did is we photoshopped out things like detail in windows. And what blew our minds pretty quickly is that the brain does not let you look at the building the same way. So here, this guy, we had 30 people look at the building as it was, 30 different people, about 33 different people look at the building photoshopped, and it was fantastic what we found. The brain is presetting how you're going to take stuff in. Basically, your non-conscious experience directs your consciousness, and that's what you can see here. So that's basically what, when you put them side by side, and I've asked about 700 people this question. Let's say I'm going to park the car and you're going to wait with the books while I do it. Do you want to wait in front of the library on the left, or would you like to wait in front of the library on the right? Where do you think people tell me instantly they'd rather wait? Any comments?
On the right.
You got it. I've asked it to 700 people. They all, and they won't know why. But the amazing thing about this powerful technology like eye tracking is you understand the subliminal subconscious experience, non-conscious experience that's directing them. You can more easily fixate on the right, so your brain tells you you're more secure there. That's what's going on there. And actually, to get it. To get the stats, what's so fascinating about people who do biometrics is they don't get emotional. They just go straight stats. They want to study what something called is the TTFF. If you go to Suffolk University Business School and Tremont Street in Boston, you'll use this exact same software. You want to know the TTFF. That's the time to first fixation, where the eyes fixate first on your ad, on your website, how quickly they found your name on the book. That's what you want to look at. The non-conscious experience. And what's fascinating here, we had, let's see, 30 people look at one on the left, 33 people looked at one on the right. When it doesn't have windows, people found the door in a fraction of the second less, 0.9 seconds. But this is what's so fascinating for me as an architect. If you've designed a windowless facade, by 12.6 seconds, the brain makes people move beyond the building. Absolutely mind-boggling. Whereas when you have the windows, the brain goes back and looks at the windows and stops looking beyond the building. So the software is incredibly powerful. It allows you to predict how people will behave before something's built. It's used by Honda, BMW, GM, Tesla. And what they do, the big billion-dollar companies, they've got the money to test everything and they run with it. They'll do eye tracking, they do facial expression analysis, they'll measure your sweat gland responses, your heart rate. They need to know to make sure they can promote consumption. And they are extremely successful. They don't argue with evolution, they run with it to a point that's a little bit terrifying. Because the technology is so good. This was a pilot study we did with some state-of-the-art software in 2016. The one on the left is a parking garage in Somerville. On the right, a friend of mine who's good in Photoshop, she made a Matisse-like fractal print. And then you can see without even conscious awareness or control, when you got the fractal beauty print, the brain doesn't let you look down the street. You look more at the beauty. But then it gets even more crazy. Now you have technology that can measure how many times people's facial expressions smiled. That's called facial expression analysis software, very popular software for tech companies, for car companies. So only like here we had, this was a pilot study, only like 5 people smiled in once, whereas when you did it here, what's amazing, we saw that people smiled without even realizing it 3 times more often. And when you smile, it releases oxytocin. That's a hugging hormone. It makes you feel good. You could actually start doing a case study saying that kids walking to school would be healthier passing this building than the one that's blank originally. So welcome to our new world. You can test and study everything. And this software is slipping into the architectural world, although most people are unaware of it. You now have algorithmic eye tracking software called 3M Visual Attention Software by 3M. It became a plugin for Photoshop in the fall of 2020. I gave a talk at Gensler 3 months ago. Nobody in the office knew it was there because it's a totally different way of thinking. They're not used to thinking about human experience. And one thing you immediately learn when you play with this is people are face-a-tex before they're architects. They're subliminally hardwired to always look for faces. This is a festival in southern Italy where they put murals on blank buildings, and you can see why this mural was so successful. Without conscious awareness or control, people immediately will look at the guy, and they'll get a different sense of their place. And then, of course, you can try it with art too. It's really amazing. Most famous painting in the world, no wonder. Without conscious awareness or control, people immediately look at the face. And that's the amazing thing that kind of blew my mind about this science, just how much we're hardwired for faces. So in 2018, I was giving 19 talks, 18 in the United States, 1 in Berlin, Germany. And before every talk, I said to a total of 500 plus people, draw a house like you're 5, and then tell me on the same index card where you were born and grew up. And this blew my mind. Turkey, India, Italy, Spain, Zambia, China, Serbia, Russia. Russia doesn't have a door, but other than that, it made no difference. It's because the non-conscious brain, that it's called the figural primitive. By the 3rd trimester in utero, the brain is already hardwired to fixate on what a social species needs most for survival. We're built for co-regulation with another face, and what we've done is we put it on our architecture. That's what's going on there. People don't realize it. And it's mind-blowing to watch people doing this, not realizing you're watching them be controlled by their unconscious, and they don't realize that's happening. And so that's what you understand with this science, that this is all architecture in Greater Boston, most of it preserved with historic district bylaws. Now you can't take it down. Well, it defines the place. Why? Because it gives us what we most need to see. Just like nature's preset how you have to have water every day, how you need to breathe, she's preset visually what the nervous system needs to see to take you out of the vigilant state. It's all preset. Mother Nature is, she's pretty much determined what she wants us to look at. Okay. And so then what's striking about this, I'll stop talking in 2 minutes. What's striking is when you start doing any biometric analysis of modern architecture, particularly urbanism from the outside, it collapses. It simply collapses. And it was like, oh my God, what's going on here? Modern architecture is completely dissociative. And the brain, so the one on the left, it's near Harvard Square. It's now a school, and a private school, and subliminally, non-consciously, people will immediately attach to the building and remember it. On the right, it's a new library in Queens, New York, about 10 years old. People are going to focus on the fire hydrant more than the building. So what happened? And to really understand this, you have to understand how our brain regulates what we need to see. And you have to also understand now, we didn't know this till the 1990s, how when a brain is traumatized, it sees the world differently. So it wasn't until magnetic resonance imaging really allows you, in the 1990s, allows you to really see how a person who's been through trauma, war, Vietnam, traumatic experience, how their brain is shifted, and the shifting in the brain will make them see reality differently. This is from Jay Winter, a professor emeritus at Yale. He noticed that World War I, we didn't count how many soldiers actually died. That has to be up to at least 10 million. And nor do we say how many suffered from PTSD, which was called shell shock at the time, at least 20%. That's the other thing. Post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't even a word in the diagnostic statistical manual doctors used until 1980. 10 years after founding modernists died. So I presented this at a medical conference. I got zero pushback. Modern architecture is a direct expression of the trauma of the World War I trench. People like Walter Gropius served 4 years in the trenches on the Western Front, and his house in Lincoln on the left here, it looks almost exactly like a bunker. Well, in PTSD, what you learn is you keep replaying the traumatic experience as the brain seeks to heal from it. And the section of his study is exactly like the section of a trench. Well, voila, that's what happens. Because subliminally, again, it's the subliminal brain, just like the people didn't realize when I gave my talks in 2018 that their subliminal brain would make them draw a face on the house. You don't realize how trauma is non-consciously, fear is non-conscious at times, is directing him to make his study and his kitchen exactly laid out like a trench. That's what's going on there. PTSD rewires the brain. And this is really 21st century science that we didn't know. You go into fight or flight and you become dissociated. So the dissociation, that is the hallmark of what we've been talking about for about 2 days now of modern architecture, where you just don't know where you are and you can't attach and it doesn't feel alive. It's not random. It's the impact of war. Margaret Macmillan has a famous 2020 book, New York Times bestseller, War, How Conflict Shaped Us. Her theory, this is an Oxford University professor, she says, we don't look at how war gave us our world. And unless we do that, it's going to be trouble. This is one way war gave us our world. It gave us PTSD. PTSD directly is one of the major missing links in what gave us modern architecture, because it puts you in dissociated state. Okay. So key founding father, Gropius Mies Neutra, were World War I vets. I showed these slides to a Harvard Medical School instructor, and in a way he shocked me. He said, well, duh, it's obvious. Every single design move, the blankness, the hidden front door, the wanting to be enclosed, it's all PTSD. So you can learn more about this. It is a complete transformation. It explains why we need traditional architecture. You have to understand that reality is a construct between your eye and your brain. The brain we have has not changed for 40,000 years. It's the exact same brain as a primate on the savannah, hunter-gatherer. And that brain, it's preset what we need to see. That's why I actually did eye track the first edition of my book, and which had the picture of the two faces. And believe it or not, everybody went right to those two faces. I showed it to the publisher. They put it on the second edition as well. That's how it is. We're having a conference about this. This is game-changing science. We need to get the science out there so that the people building our cities and towns know it. Still to this day, I am a licensed architect. There was zero psychology, zero biology requirement. It's ridiculous. When the car companies master it, the architects know nothing about it. So we're having a conference about this at Tufts. And I think that's about it. A quick learning objectives. Understand that unconscious processing directs our behavior. The car companies, the business schools, they know that. It's not your conscious that really directs your behavior, it's your unconscious. CO biometric tools, including eye tracking, facial expression, why they're so powerful, why the business school at Suffolk University on Fremont Street just opened a biometric lab with the same powerful tools that Honda, GM, BMW, Tesla use. Learn how evolutionary history has preset what we need to see. It's the way it works. Appreciate meanings of fixation and pre-attentive processing. That's the big deal that I think my next book is be about how this work is as important for architecture as it is for advertising. Okay, thank you. You can take part in our building studies right now. We're using the same software that Tesla uses. It's called iMotions Online. You can do it online if you have a webcam. You're welcome to take a part. Just go to geneticsofdesign.com. Thank you. Final thought. Traditional architecture mirrors externally our hidden internal brain design. It expresses the human need to be seen, the social primate need to be seen, and mirrored to feel at our best how mammals coagulate. That's it, guys. And I'm ready to go to the next person.
I'm happy to go because I spoke with Anne yesterday and we really connected on some of her research. And so I'm going to speak more about the importance of ornament and beauty in my talk tomorrow after Witold's presentation. But so what I'm going to just show you is I've always wanted to be an architect since I was young and blah, blah. And so I always drew houses, and what corresponded with the things that I drew and did when I was young was exactly what Anne just spoke about. So I'm just going to show that as an example to sort of make that case, if you will. And so I'll be brief. Does everyone see this little goofy house here?
I love it.
Yeah, we
All right,
do.
so this was, my mom would drag me around her art classes and they'd sit me in the corner and they'd tell me, do this. This was a little house I did on my own, just goofing off. This is the neighborhood I grew up in Rome, Italy. It's EUR. It's a suburb of Rome designed by Mussolini, but it was mostly built in the 50s and 60s. So besides the few fascist monuments downtown, it's really just a bunch of, boxes like this. So it's just kind of weird that, I would just go ahead and build this out of nothing when this is what I was surrounded by as I went around eating pizza and playing soccer and all that. Anyway, when I got into high school, I said, okay, I want to be an architect. So I took the drafting classes. And so I drew this, which, as you can see, has a face-like quality. But being from DC, we'd go to Georgetown, which is at that point was the only, anyway, it had life and it was somewhat safe and it was attractive. So my friends would say, let's go, let's do this, let's do that. And I'd say, let's go to Georgetown. They'd say, what do you want to do there? And I'm like, hang out, just be in Georgetown. The reason is because it was just so stimulating. It was just a beautiful place to be. So when I was in college, as soon as I was done with my modernist foundation year, where they try to brainwash you and tell you to forget everything you know about architecture, which is impossible. It's literally not possible, but it's based on Gropius's Bauhaus of Vaucours. They finally said, oh, do a townhouse. So I did a townhouse, and lo and behold, I just did a face for whatever reason. Again, I didn't know any of the science behind this stuff. So then another project before I really discovered that, maybe I can just play with history. This is right before, was a house for single moms. And, it was all compartmentalized in terms of different relationships and this and that. But anyway, it's just a school project. So, but it has these qualities completely, unconscious or whatever, in terms of it wanting to be a face. Later on, there was a project to do, this is the Harvard Club in New York, somewhere in Midtown. McKinley and White did this, and then there was an addition. So the object was to add a building to the left because there was a vacant lot at the time. So this is a Harvard Club. This was the tower done in 1914. And all I did was imitate what the Harvard Club was doing, mirrored that tower, created this center. So again, eyes, mouth, nose. I don't know if Ann mentioned this, but when you're a baby, you just stare at that face of your mother's and your father's if he's, down with it. And that's just how you learn to say, I'm going to need to make it with this person. This person's my connection. And this pattern is the first pattern that's imprinted in your brain. So again, I got caught up into that whole modernist, traditionalist nonsense. And so I always got my head beat in by the professors, but I intuitively knew that walking out of school, I was going to be working for people like my mother and my neighbor. And they all seemed incredibly intelligent, despite what my professors were saying. So I decided never to get an A, but to at least, have trained myself in designing stuff that people might like. So even if it's not necessarily traditional, and then finally, my last year, this is my last year project at Pratt, where this was the existing context, and this is what I proposed. And I remember my professor saying, oh, why do you like all these little things, and she pointed at my building and as if I had, spit on it or something. And at this point, after 5 years of school, I just thought to myself, this is so ridiculous. I mean, and the funny thing was, she was wearing Corinthian column
The video
earrings.
to accompany the poster, Modern Architecture, a direct
And so I didn't know what to say. So I finally said, Mrs. Perkins, I like all these little things for the same reason you like those things on your ears. I just do. Now, obviously, there's 1,000 reasons that go behind this elevation, and they correspond to plan and structure and had all these ideas, but nobody wants to hear them, especially the modernists, ironically, because the moment they saw the facade, they just didn't want to know anymore, and they just kind of cut you off. And so this was just a sort of three-dimensional model of, I try to look at Louis Kahn's Exeter Library as a kind of a pass on being, not to be seen as someone who hated modernism. I just didn't like it. And then finally, I'll just end with this. This is a slide that one of several that I was preparing for tomorrow that I showed Ann, and she said, wow, that's terrific. And this is just showing how, whether it was in Manchester, Italy, in the 1600s, or Amsterdam at the beginning of the 20th century, or Beaux-Arts, I think that's Paris. This is Barcelona. Anyway, Madrid, and I think this is Brussels. It's just what we do. So it's nothing to do with, hating modernism or feeling nostalgic for a past that didn't exist. It's hardwired in us. And with that, I will pass it on to the next person.
Wonderful. If you
And
don't
who-
mind, I'd go next because I think I have a huge connection to both Anne and your talk, in that I want to
Yeah.
talk a little bit about the neuroscience and processing behind all this. So I think that would be a good switch, if Anne really agrees.
I just want to say, Dan, thank you so much. That was really great. This idea that we're hardwired for something is really important. I think in the 20th century, we pretended we weren't. Steven Pinker, the Harvard professor, wrote a famous book about this, The Blank Slate, The Modern Denial of Human Nature. And when you start looking at traditional architecture, it fits, it mirrors human nature. And that's why modern doesn't work. But I really appreciated your beautiful drawings. Thank you so much.
Yeah, sure.
So Anne, who do
Yeah.
you want to go next?
I think anyone who's up to you guys, whoever would like to go.
I think a woman just said she felt it would follow well.
I think
Sorry.
I might follow up quite nicely. I just want to say a couple of brief words about the neuroscience behind all of this, like why there is such a strong connection about where we look and what that does to us. And maybe as a tidbit, while I'm sharing my screens, it is really interesting to see all these house entrances because they're actually used for diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. So because of their face-like qualities. And
You're good.
wonderful. Yeah, it always catches me when I'm on a Windows machine. So the thing is that they can still kind of dissect a building in a way that they cannot dissect a face. But it also hampers their overall, natural experience with a building that Anne and Daniel have pointed out very well, and that they do not make that connection. It's kind of severed in between a building and a face. But what I want to talk about really is that there is innate necessary connection between where our eyes want to go and where our bodies and our hands want to go, which is what Neil called the eye-brain nexus. And so this might be fairly obvious to somebody like myself who's been kind of trained in the visual arts, that where your hands go is kind of linked to where your eyes want to go, but there's actual neuroscience research that tells us why this is the case. And so I just want to very briefly tell you a tiny bit about neuroanatomy because it fits so very well with this story. So if we look at the brain and how it is very roughly divided, what we can see is that the motor cortex, located right here on the edge that goes right from ear to ear on your brain, is right next to your somatosensory cortex. And so the region that tells you where your body wants to move is right next to the brain regions that give you information about what you're looking at and what you're hearing. And that is no coincidence. It is because the process of actually telling this brain region here a little bit more frontally that guides your movements gets input from your senses, necessarily needs to be so. So the real first step before you take any sort of actions like reaching for your mug to drink is that your visual cortex at the very back of your head sends input to the same region that then sends input to a region right in front of the one that actually does the signal go there, that is planning the actual movement, with a little bit of information from the very frontal part of your brain that actually gives you some sort of more control than a toddler or say a lower animal would have. So there's direct information flow from the most importantly, the visual cortex, but also the other senses towards the areas that are actually involved in planning. And that is why they're so very close together, probably in the brain location-wise. This has actually been known not that long in the scope of overall human history, but very long time ago in the scope of psychology research, that there is an intrinsic connection between eye and especially hand movements. And just wanted to show you where eye tracking, the technology that is so very advanced that Anne has showed you, came from. So the first study that ever literally showed that there's a causal link between eye movements, that is where you look and where your hand goes. And it looked something like this. So eye trackers in these days were not mounted to some sort of screen where you could look at images. They were mounted on your head. And the computer that did all the processing was a huge and very heavy backpack that you had to carry around with you. So what these researchers did in 1999 was simply have all of the authors walk around with this weird eye tracking contraption that also recorded what they were doing at the same time and make a pot of tea. Because they were British, and so making a pot of tea was very overtrained and very common occurrence in their life. And what they could then analyze with this sort of footage was where people were going, what they were looking at, and what they were doing. And so they made these little diagrams and quantified them somewhat in these sort of spreadsheets. And the thing I want you to take away from this here is that on the very top row, you see gross body movements. On the middle and the bottom, the two interesting things. So in the middle, you will see where the eyes were fixated on. So here, for instance, the first thing that was really fixated was the kettle. And then on the bottom row, you see the action that was taken. And that you will always notice this kind of offset between the middle row and the bottom row. And that is the eye movement always kind of precedes the action that was being taken. Your eye has to go to a certain location in order for your body to actually be able to do something at that location. And that was a really, really impactful insight that then spurred a surge of research that showed even more intricate links between eye and body movements. And so that is not where my inherent interest lies. I'm a psychologist and a psychophysicist, so I'm coming from this visual perceptual science, but these days I'm interested in aesthetics. I'm interested in the pleasure that the things that we look at give us. And so now very recently, people have linked this connection between where we look at and what we are doing to the pleasure that we receive from looking at a certain thing. And they discovered a beauty bias that kind of transfers very naturally to our actions as well. So Anne has already told you that we look at things that are face-like, that are attractive more often. But now Anjan Chatterjee and his colleagues did an experiment, and others did others in the same way that showed the same results, that showed that the hands follow this bias as well. So what they did is they had a very simple number comparison task where there was a number on the middle and one number on the top left, on the top right. And the task was very simple. People should just move the cursor to the number that was closer to the number in the middle. And the faces they were told to completely ignore. But behind the scenes, there were unattractive faces, neutral faces, and attractive faces. And so what they measured was what kind of path did the mouse cursor take to the number, and then compare the deviation in the optimal path, so just a straight path to the correct answer, between the unattractive, the neutral, and the attractive faces. And lo and behold, what they found was that not only was, we know that the eye is more attracted to the attractive faces, but that also the hand was attracted more to the attractive faces. So here's just one little example where you see the dashed line shows you what the path looks like when you're moving towards an attractive face, and the solid line shows you what your path looks like when you're moving to an unattractive face. So there's this way larger deviation in the path your hand needs to take if it needs to move towards an unattractive face. And that is very logical if you think about this inherent connection between your eye always wants to dictate where your body, where your hands go. So there's this inherent beauty bias, not only in where your eyes move, but also where your body and your hands want to move. And that's by now been shown in a few studies. So it's not very solid, but I think it's a very logical and very promising line of research. And of course, we can do statistical tests on this and show that it's reliable, at least if we average across participants. What it's got me thinking a little bit about, and maybe we can have a little discussion about this later on. I thought I had a little bit more time. It's like, what's the application of all this? Well, first of all, again, very much in line with what Anne has been saying, big companies, in this case, VW, have already started exploiting these connections. And in this case, it's very beneficial, I believe, for the community, in that they did a little experiment, the subway station of Stockholm, Odenplan, where instead of having the stairs look very plain, they kind of transformed them into this more, I would say, more attractive piano staircase-like pattern, and then recorded people's behavior. You can watch the video maybe later on. I'll post it in the chat. It's very amusing. And 66% more people took the stairs if they were just, arranged in appealing pattern to look at. It also played some musical notes. In my case, I think it just transfers to other domains, but the visual one as well. And then a little bit more speculatively, I can't play you, I don't have the time. I think this also tells us something about how we should design environments for better orientation, because if our eyes and our bodies are attracted to things that are actually attractive looking, then a design like Frankfurt Airport will always be my pet peeve, where your eyes just don't want to look anywhere. You just want to shut down. It's so ugly. Won't do anything for people actually navigating the place. However, I found much better examples online now, and this one struck me as one of the most beautiful ones, actually. It's Baku Heydar Aliyev Airport in Azerbaijan, where, you know, even just those trees that have these natural fractalized properties draw your eyes exactly in the locations where you need to go in order to advance. So making orientation way more efficient and enjoyable for everybody. So I hope I didn't overdo my time, but that's all I got to say. So thanks a lot to you and everybody who made this possible.
Thank you so much for bringing in the science in really beautifully intriguing ways. I think we've got a book there. That was really wonderful. And,
we should bring in Anjan. He did those studies, you know.
No, let's do it. This is the beginning. I told her this is the beginning of something big. So do you want to go, Michael, next? Did you want to go?
Sure, I'm ready. Are you guys ready? Okay, I'll try to do this quickly in order to save some time. I know we're running a little late. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Oh, beauty.
All right, I'm going to talk about the B word, beauty. This word that we all seems to have been banished from the discourse and is coming back in because of some of the research. And I'm just going to very briefly go over some of this very interesting research. Now, first of all, a puzzle. You all know Vitruvius's triad, right? Firmitas, Utilitas, Venustas. And that was translated by Sir Henry Wotton in 1624 to firmness, commodity, and delight. Why delight? Delight, Venustas does not mean delight. It means beauty, very simply. If you look at any translation, anybody who knows Latin, delight is another word, delectatio, and so on. So what's going on there? I think what we need to recognize is that was the period when, of course, the Cartesian era and the era of Spinoza and Leibniz, when people were trying to put science on an objective basis, and anything that was seen as subjective, like beauty, a human experience, was to be banished, right? Well, that was a very fateful action. If you look at Google's Ngram viewer, for example, the incidence of different words in books from about 1800, you can see architectural beauty reaches its peak about 1840 and then suffers a very steep decline to the modern day. Architectural function, on the other hand, is the exact inverse and peaking about 1960 or so. So that's something that's supposedly rational that we can get our hands on, right? But I think what we're recognizing now is that beauty has to come back into the picture, and we have to confront what this experience is that we call beauty, because it's an objective experience that we share, and the structures that generate it are objective as well. So a lot of people are talking about, yes, we need beauty. Brent Tadarian, the former head planner of Vancouver. But when you Google beautiful building, these are some of the buildings you get, this sort of edgy, spooky, wild stuff, right? Well, that, of course, is logical if you remember that a lot of these are architecture students, aficionados of these kinds of buildings, right? But if you Google beautiful place, you get much more naturalistic environments. You begin to get traditional environments. And indeed, if you Google beautiful town, you get all traditional environments. Clearly, there's a broader population of people that are doing these searches and populating these results. So what the research tells us is, first of all, beauty, what people describe as beauty, is an underappreciated factor in community satisfaction. That's clear from the research. There's an economic component to that, which certainly gets people's attention when you see that there's a way to make money when people at least say they experience something as beautiful. This idea that it's only in the eye of the beholder is actually disproven by the research. What we can see, for example, this study shows that the orbitofrontal cortex is differentially engaged, et cetera. There is a physical thing going on that is consistent across different people when they say, I'm seeing something beautiful. And this goes back to Edmund Burke, even in the 1700s, talking about some mechanical process or physical objective process that comes through us upon the mind by the intervention of the senses. There's something going on that is objective. And the results are showing that there's of course, there are two components. There is the embodied natural beauty, as this study describes, and then there is a social construction component. We see the architecture students who are looking at the swoopy stuff, right? The sort of outlier stuff, if you will. And so, yes, there are social constructions that differentiate, but they differentiate from a common root, the biological root that we all share. And most people are still pretty much clustered in the middle on that. And yes, there are outliers, of course, of various kinds. And there are people who are professionals and specialists who tend to get much more the outlier in their concerns and in their points of view and in their own judgments. And we have to be careful about that if we're going to be designing for not just for other professionals, other architects, but for everybody, right? For the people who are going to live in these places. And this is where Samir Zeki's work is very interesting. I think he's a neuroscientist, neuroaesthetics at University College London. He says this is clearly hardwired into our brains. The research is clear, and that even in the domain of architecture, beauty is not quite as subjective as it might seem. In fact, there are inherited brain concepts of proportion, harmony, geometric relationships can be expressed in mathematical terms, symmetry, and so on. I'll talk about that a little later. And this idea, this very important idea that it is not a luxury, it's an essential ingredient in nourishing the emotional brain. I love that expression. I think it's very important. And so a lot of the other research is showing what is it that triggers the experience of beauty and also the experience of ugliness. Those are related. And it seems to be an avoidance-motivated emotional response, ugliness, that triggers disgust and discomfort and unease and triggers stress and so on, because we want to get away from whatever that is. And it seems to be that has to do with those places being likely to have pathogens or likely to have other components that are not good for us, that we want to get away from them, right? And this is something intuitively we can understand. Rotten food, dangerous places, disease, lack of sanitation and so on. These are things that we find ugly for obvious reasons. And places where we are safe, where we feel well, where we feel healthy, and we have healthy environments to be in, those are places that we find beautiful. And the mathematical properties of those we find beautiful, the symmetries and the formal relationships and so on. And this is, of course, the root of the whole movement in biophilia, which I think is very interesting. Many of you know that, this idea that our experience of our environments is rooted in our evolutionary history, and we want to be near natural forms and forms that are related to nature. Roger Ulrich did this famous study in 1984 showing that recovery from surgery was actually better when people had a view of a natural scene. That got a lot of attention, and there's been a lot of work since then on related findings, indeed confirming that, beginning to transform healthcare environments, and we certainly hope so, because they can be quite awful, as we know. And this idea that it's not only literal vegetation and animals and so on, it's also the qualities of nature, light and air and water and so on, that is rooted in our history. We've been in these environments for much, much more of our evolutionary history than we've been in artificial environments. Not only vegetation, but light and water, natural geometries, biomimicry, information richness, patina, etc. And not only in the vegetation around us, but the properties in the buildings, the actual geometric characteristics of the buildings that have these properties that turn out to be very important for promoting our well-being and our health, and promoting our sense of ecology, because it seems pretty clear that the places that we love are the places that we're going to take care of. And that is something, the science of the beauty of the world is necessary to its survival, as this author pointed out. And the idea that we want to create environments that are conducive to walkability, bikeability, resource efficient, low carbon lifestyles, and so on. Those are all very important components to this idea of beauty. And again, lowering stress levels. There's a lot of research coming in on that now. And my colleague Nikos Salingaros and I have been doing work on mathematical symmetry and its importance in beauty and in our experience of environments. And this is symmetry in the broad sense of the term in mathematics and physics and many other fields. That's very important impact on human perception and well-being. Not just the left and right symmetry, which, you know, we architects tend to dumb it down, I'm afraid. There's also rotational and translational and scaling. And there are a lot of compound symmetries, there are information symmetries, all the sort of rich fractal characteristics that are symmetries, and what I've referred to as deep symmetry, where we feel our deep relationship to the thing that we're viewing, whether it's a human body or a sunset or a building that's gently rotating in the landscape and so on. And there's been some work, actually some work based on my work that's quite interesting in looking at so the work of this particular architect and how that is evoking deep symmetries in the characteristics of the building that we find beautiful and that we find sustainable in the Pantheon, for example, more so than just shrubbing it up, cloaking otherwise unbeautiful building in shrubbery, not likely to last. And again, the impacts on health that are so important that I alluded to. Nikos and I described what we call a symmetry deficit disorder, following on Richard Louve's term nature deficit disorder, that we are creating health issues, health impacts on our users when we create these ugly environments. And this is something I think architects have to take seriously. One last quick plug, we're going to be doing our conference where we're going to be talking about all these things at Poundbury in the UK, October 10th to the 13th. We'd love to see many of you there, and we would love to carry on this conversation there. Go to imcl.online and you can see it. Thanks.
Thank you. This has been wonderful. We could have a whole conference just with this talk here. This has been so wonderful. Any follow-up questions? I've just been
A
told.
quick remark. In 15 minutes, we should move on to the next panel. So thank you all for your contributions.
Yeah, 15 minutes. So we have other folks, don't we, Anne, that need to speak?
No, I think Richard Taylor was on, but I don't see him online.
Oh, okay.
Okay, I'm ready, and when you are.
Okay, go
No,
ahead.
let Nir
Go for it,
go.
Nir.
Okay, well, everything that's been discussed here, and I don't think that anybody can rattle off all of the terminology as well as Michael Mahaffey has just done. All the stuff that's associated with, touched on with the notion of beauty, all of that is in the realm of effect. And the real question is, what might be the cause of this all? And how do we actually give me a, when I've talked for 3 minutes, give me a heads up, Mr. Voresh, please. And all this is really a question of how do we start parsing this out? How do we actually think about this? So I'd like to share with you chapter 6 in The Art of Classic Planning, which of all the parts of the book was edited by numerous people, philosophers, neuroscientists, mathematicians. Our experience, our urban experience is really a matter of, we experience it personally, and we go to places that we love and want to see and are told that they're really, really pretty. And it turns out that a lot of the tourism goes to these places that either have, I'm speaking of urban environments, are either naturally beautiful or beautiful in their own right. And the question is then, what created those places? What's in them that might attract us? And the answer is that they live in a balance, in a continual balance, because not all places have either the one side or the other, and in out energy and an out in energy, so to speak, where you have a reason for being. Usually it's locational, and a community aspiration from the inside, self-recognition by members of the community that they are going to create, develop, and embellish their community. And they do it in a way that makes their life better, that improves their opportunity actually for community service to bring their best to the community. At the end of the day, all the studies about urban happiness point to the matter of beauty. People feel safer in beautiful environments, and people perform better. And even Jane Jacobs speaks about all these wonderful things: the eyes on the street, the kids playing, the ballet of the street life, the hot dog cart on the corner. And she forgot one thing: she lived in a beautiful environment, the village. On the beauty scale, it's probably a 7, maybe an 8 in places. It's really, really lovely. Because in her day, people were not looking at the environment, at the traditional environment, as if it had any value. It was just old. And she fell into that mode.
Dr.
But then the
Boris,
question,
your 3-minute warning.
okay, give me another 3-minute warning. Thank you.
Sure.
The business of beauty and holism is a very interesting thing. I don't know how many people realize that the term holism was coined in 1926. It's a new term, but it really means the unity of truth, goodness, and beauty. And I invite you to read Jan Smut's book with regard to that. But the idea of holism is that if you are measuring one thing, you're measuring it all. And if you are changing one thing, you're changing it all. And Zeki, that Michael Mahaffey just mentioned, in 2004, actually went and documented where in the brain positive visual aesthetic experience, what we call beauty, occurs in the brain. Ugliness does not show up, believe it or not. Actually, ugliness simply means very little beauty. So the beauty spectrum is from the most beautiful to the least beautiful, which we generally term ugly. And after all this idea that, well, if you can find it in some kind of a mechanical scan of the brain, you can also quantify it. So the perception of beauty becomes something that is, on the one hand, it's individual. Obviously, every single individual is experiencing it, but there's a part of it, the first 50 to 150 milliseconds of that perception. And we did that in a paper with Anna Brielman, Nikos, and Richard Taylor last year, that actually sequenced what happened in your brain, what happens in your brain when you walk down the street. And understanding that perception is something that people have been really struggling with, but it is through supercomputers and fractal mathematics that we now understand that multiple fractals in a certain range, you see here examples of fractals, you know them all, you've seen them before, likely. Fractal is any pattern that is self-similar at different scales. A tree has 3 fractals in it simultaneously. The limbs, the branches, the twigs, they all have the same geometry, rotate off one another in the same way. But then you have the leaves, which in the perspective you see as self-similar at different scale. And then you have the bark, which is an obviously recognizable pattern, and it is a statistical fractal of some sort. So that's 3 just in a tree, in a single tree.
Also, your next 3-minute warning.
Thank you.
Nir, I wanted to respond to one point about ugliness. I mentioned that one paper that seems to be able to correlate ugliness to disgust, which is the biological aversion.
That's not, yeah, I know what you're saying, and that's true. That's true in that paper, and I'm not going into that direction at all. I'm just doing it in the visual, because what we have in the built environment, we rarely get that kind of disgust. In the built environment,
I think it's interesting because what I think it tells us, there's that spectrum there, and in both cases, the biological response has to do with our own seeking of our well-being and our ability to find our well-being. And then it happens in 2 forms. First of all, it's an indicator of our well-being, and secondly, it impacts our well-being in its own right as an aesthetic experience. And I wanted to respond also to Brielman's point.
Hold on. We're not responding yet. I need to finish my little pitch. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you. What I learned in the research was that the way the eyes actually see stuff before it's even processed is edges. And the rhythm of edges, the recurring, self-similar arrangements of edges in the classical method, we have 7 different proportions running in everything, starting from symmetry. That's a proportion of 1-to-1 equality. We have large, small, that is the golden section, which you have here in cyan, and in the blue, you have punctuation. There are several others. We don't need to talk about them now, but you see here 2 of these, 3 of these, you don't need to see because you're an expert already at the ones that are bilateral symmetry, how many of those you have going, but then you also have this multitude of symmetries going in this specific aesthetic method throughout the design. Now, was this effect? People figured this out. They did it so very quickly. From the point of understanding the truth, beauty, and goodness were a unity. The Greeks, within 50 years, had their orders started out vigorously. In terms of the research that was done, I don't know if he's here, but Richard Taylor was part of the team that did the initial. This was back in the 80s when people didn't understand anything about visual perception, really. They were designing the space station. They needed to figure out the background of the walls, what to put on the inside the station. And they found that the African savanna sort of image was the most pleasing to most people. But what we do know is that there's a ton of phenomenological confirmation, and I don't need to go into that. I think that Anne mentioned a lot of that. At the end of the day, the classical method does give you these things. And when I say method, it's not the styles alone. This is the architecture of architectures, call it the native architectures of the whole world, traditionally, as they were trying to create their environments. And this goes into the fact that all the styles of all the world are available for us to work with, much like we have different chords and scales in music. Last thing I want to say, everything I've spoken about is about how we perceive the still environment. The way we perceive animals is different. I don't know exactly how it is, and we're starting that research now. But you know that things that are not stable in the environment are animals. They move around, and many of them could hurt us. I want to suggest that we process cars as large animals. Think of a street with no cars. You might have some sense of being relaxed. Now put a car in it, and you might have a sense that your stress jumps a bit. You know that furniture, traditional furniture, has feet on it. Did you ever ask yourself why? I want to propose that it's because it is somehow associated in our brains with the idea of animals. And finally, there has been only one experiment out there in the world with the perception of dangerous animals. And although snakes are more dangerous than gazelles, we are more fearful of gazelles than of snakes. And it seems that size matters. So we're afraid of cars. We have a fear, an inborn fear of those objects, which makes us uncomfortable in the street when they're present, whether we are conscious of it or not, apparently. But also, cyclists are about the size of a gazelle. And if you've ever driven a car and you have a cyclist close to you, or you're walking and they get too close, it's alarming. So I'm thinking that we actually, this is the last statement, we actually need to reconfigure our thinking with regard to traffic and the street and how a classic street behaves from scratch, because all of traffic and all of traffic planning is apparently based on some inadequate and incomplete information. So thank you for letting me share with you that train of thinking.
Okay, well, here I have one quick comment, is that we actually did eye track Newbury Street and Boylston Street. I can show you pictures of it or send you guys all a link. And we found that people had more arousal. We measured their galvanic skin, more arousal on Boylston Street, and there were more cars there. And what happened, it blew our minds. We eye tracked them without, they didn't even realize it. They would focus on the cars, even if they were parked. It was unbelievable. And so that's why taking cars out of the street makes the brain not focus on them. You don't control where your brain looks. Your brain evolved to see a car, just as Nir said, as a large animal.
And,
I'll send
and
you a
this-
But
list.
is that because
this
the
is the
cars also
thinking-
all have face-like features, right?
Oh, and I can send you it. There's a
They
2007.
used to have face-like features. They've made them now more insect-like in the last 10, 20 years, which
But-
is, it's a whole other, listen, we're touching here, just to repeat what Ann said, we're touching here a vast area of thinking that needs to take place. And we've only just touched the surface of it. It has been made possible with computation and with machines and so on and so forth. I'm not against machines. I'm just differentiating between, in the built environment, the place of fabric and the place of machines. Ultimately, I love driving and I love cars. My driving experience has deteriorated in the last 10 years, 15 years. Is it because of how the streets are designed? Is it because of the laws? Is it because the cars have become intentionally ugly? I don't really know, but this kind of consciousness is what I'm pushing for. And really my personal drive to work with you all here at these gatherings and really bring together is push the thinking. And we're the only folks in the built environment who are actually doing these things on materials, on neuroscience, et cetera, et cetera. So thank you for being my inspiration. And I'm going to
Nir?
let everybody go. Anne, you want to,
Well, I
Take
think
over,
this has
thank
been
you.
fascinating. I'm just, again, you put together, you're a master chef for ideas, and you put together this recipe. Not only this, 5-course meal over 2 days, but just the ideas you got us together were great. I've never spoken before with the people, and it was just wonderful. Thank you so much, Nir.
thank you all. Let's get your 4 points started. Mr. Cantors, close the session, start the session, the recording. Let's get the CEUs out there. And I think people can fill out the CEUs as the next session begins. Does anybody want like a 2-minute break? Don't tell me I'm tying you down to the chair for too long. And sorry, Michael, for stopping you like this, but we're trying to keep a schedule. I really apologize.
I just addressed Ann Brillman's comment in the chat. No problem. She had made a comment I wanted to respond to.
Yeah, thanks, appreciate it.
I would really like to see really strong working session that sort of brings together the Christopher Alexander method and the classical method, because they overlap in many ways. And I think that we can actually go a 3-way, Beaux-Arts, Christopher Alexander, and classical method, and find somehow both a curriculum for moving architecture forward academically, but also find the common ground so that we, at the end of the day, we have the knowledge that can help heal the world.
Nir, I'd like to help with the Beaux-Arts, and
Okay.
just
Sure.
to quote my old hero Andres Duani, if you want to get something done well, why not just use the methods that produce the great results in the first place? So if you want environments that look as gorgeous as that would be the in my mind would be a great place to start.
I think you're totally right. And we need to do that. Sorry. We're going in, and that's kind of what we're saying is if you have something that works, why not use it?
Right.
It has worked very well. So that's kind of the work I'm doing these days, addressing that. I don't know what happened here in our beautiful little, oh, I see. Okay. We're going to the next session, and that session was supposed to be moderated by Maria Sanchez. Can we have the CEU form, please, Mr. Cantor? Certificate request, thank you.